Hello everyone, I'm Debbie McConnell, Chair of Lancashire, Liverpool City Region and Greater Manchester Group of CPRE Countryside Charity. Thank you for joining us tonight, and before we begin, some housekeeping rules which you'll see on the screen in front of you. So the lecture will be recorded. Please leave your camera off and mute your microphone unless you are speaking. And if you do speak to ask a question, for example, if you could remember to mute after you've asked the question. After my introduction, each speaker will give a presentation. Each one is going to last around 20 minutes. Please save your questions for the end of each talk, after which there will be time set aside for them to be asked. To ask a question, use the raise hand function in the participant menu. You will see that on the screen in front of you, how to do that if you've not done it before. You click your name first and then raise hand. Alternatively, if you prefer, use the chat function. So you'll see the little symbol, looks like a balloon. Click on that and you can type in your question, and myself and Becca will be keeping an eye on those questions so that we can ask them or deal with them at the appropriate time. Okay, everybody. So let's kick off. So where did it all begin for soil? 4.6 billion years ago, planet Earth was a ball of volcanic activity suffering constant meteorite bombardment. There was no land or sea, no oceans or rivers, and as far as we know, no life. Then, and around 3.8 billion years ago, conditions stabilised and seas and lakes formed. They weathered and eroded Earth's rocky crust formed from the solidified magma, and the planet's first soils were created, although not the soil that we would recognise today, as it was completely sterile. But when Homo sapiens first walked the planet around 100,000 years ago, soil teemed with life. Today it is the home of bacteria, fungi, insects, animals, and much more. In productive soil, a teaspoon contains millions or even billions of microorganisms. It is the foundation of virtually all life on the planet and critical to its good health, yet we pay scant attention to what goes on under our feet, despite its importance, unless, of course, we farm, are gardeners, or scientists. So let me now introduce two people who have direct experience, knowledge, and expertise, and will shine a light on soils. Helen Greaves obtained a first-class degree in ecology at the University of East Anglia, gained a distinction in her MSc at the University of Liverpool, is a published science writer, secretary of both the European Pond Conservation Network and Norfolk Ponds Project, and is now at UCL's Environmental Change Research Centre, where she is with the Pond Restoration Research Group, doing a PhD assessing the value of pond management for biodiversity. Chris Molyneux has farming in his blood and in his heart. His family have owned land in South Lancashire since the Norman conquest, and he is a fifth-generation farmer at the 400-acre Molyneux Kale company. He gained a degree at the University of Reading in agriculture, worked for a year on Australian farms, and is passionate about soil and soil health, putting that passion into growing 500 tonnes of green kale annually. Other kales, such as purple, variegated and Japanese white, and a variety of other green vegetables. If you go to a grocer's or a supermarket and buy kale, or Cavolo Nero, for example, it has probably been grown on Chris's farm. I adore kale in all its guises and have done for many years. It is now much easier to source thanks to Chris and appreciated by far more people, particularly the wonderful black kale, known to the Italians, of course, as cavolo nero or black cabbage. It is wonderfully nutritious, packed full of minerals and vitamins, including isocyanates, luteins and zeaxanthin, beta-carotene, vitamin K, vitamin A, vitamin C, and calcium. Hooray for kale. So for our first speaker, Chris, over to you, Chris.
Hello there, everybody. Can you see me now? Yes, and I think we should have some slides coming up somewhere as well. So there we go. We're just starting with the first one. So there we go. Soil health and farmer's perspective. That's my sort of little take on it. So I think you've done the intro for me, Debbie. So I don't really need to worry about that one. Obviously, I can't really add anything to that except that yes, I am very, very keen on soil, and that's my big thing. Added to which, I'm very keen on kale. So if you just want to put the next slide up, please. So obviously there we go. That's what we grow. I added. I think basically Debbie sort of listed everything. I put a pretty picture to it, and I'm quite interested in the bottom one there. The Italian chicory and the Italian oriental brassicas are something a bit different. What we try to do is try to grow all year round, and products that we can produce in the UK all year round, or as long as we can, or in times when you can't. So Italian chicories are really good because they allow us to actually produce a salad crop in the winter. So I've got some chicories growing out there. They've taken all that frost, and I just peel back the top, and then I can actually sell it as a salad product rather than bringing it in from abroad at this time of the year. So that's just basically it. And then the spring greens are where it all started, because that was my great, well, I don't know how far back, grandfather's crop, and we kept the seed from that. And from that, we've kept the seed year on year for generations, and then we re-sow it again. And of course, the end of that is we've bred our own types of kale as well from that. So we've actually bred it, we've crossed it with the spring green with the kale and produced our own types of kale and cavolo as well. So we'll move on to that later. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is how I got into really the environmental side of farming, for want of a better word. I don't like to use that because I think we have to start thinking about, as that's a big circle, and you see all the different parts of the community. You've got the landscape, you've got the water management, the energy efficiency, animal husbandry, all those things, and it all comes integrated farm management. That's where I got into it, because I had a customer wanting me to join this so I could supply them. And I think actually at the time we were supplying Waitrose via somebody else. So so I was supplying this person, they were supplying to Waitrose. So I got into this and said, well, I will join up on that. And when I actually got into it, I was already doing quite a lot of the things that LEAF, which stands for Linking Environment and Farming. And it's that linking thing that we're coming back to, about everything's connected and everything's part of a whole. And I really want to push that one going forward, because I think it's very important, because soil really does, it just lives that. It's so connected together. It's just what it's all about. And it's very important we think along those lines going forward. So can I have the next slide, please? Right, so this is where we started with soil. This is my first, I always remember this is one of my first lectures when I was in soil science, when we were at college. And you've got this triangle. In the bottom left is sand, bottom right silt, and the top clay. And then what you've got is you've got different proportions. So that's what we call those different soils. And of course, how you define a soil is dependent on how much sand you've got, how much clay you've got, and how much silt you've got. And also the different variations. So the perfect farming soils right in the middle somewhere, where you've got a loam to a clay loam, possibly into a sandy loam, depending on what you're going to grow. Silt loams are good. Silt loams and silts can grow good crops too, but they are limited in some ways. Really sandy soils aren't very good for growing things like cereals. And then the clay soils are really only suitable for grass. It's very hard to grow good crops of cereals or vegetables on those sorts of soils. So it's obviously, you can see how those differences very important for a farmer. But that's just the start of the story, because that's what originally I was taught. You know, I was taught that this is the soil triangle, and when we work out from that, and then we add our fertilizer to it, and everything grows brilliantly. There's a lot more to it than that. For starters, that soil takes between 10 and 30,000 years to form, because basically all the soils that we're looking at here weren't here because it was actually covered in ice sheet about between 10 and 30,000 years ago. And of course, as the ice sheets receded, you just got bare rock or bare gravel or whatever was left underneath, the regolith, for want of a better word, from the ice sheets had sort of scraped off. Then it also had to start developing from that. So regolith is sort of like what they call a base rock. And that's what we're discussing about how it came to. And it's the breaking down of that and the movement of that that actually creates your soil. So our soils are about between 10 and 30,000 years old, which is still a long time. It takes a long time for that to develop. But the big thing is, can I have the next slide, please? Organic matter. This is the big one. This is the one that is so important for everybody and for the whole planet, the whole world, everything you eat, everything, even when you're breathing and things like that. It's so important. When I was doing my training, we didn't really concentrate too much on organic. It was just an irritant that got in the way. Really, the scientific side of the 1970s, early 80s farming was, you had your soil, which is basically that triangle we had before. Then you added your fertilizer to it, and it grew a bit like a sterile environment. And then all of a sudden, we start to realize this isn't quite what's going on. And I think that's the new knowledge and new understanding has been coming about in science and in farming as well, about how this organic matter, which is made up of the humus, which is actually this doesn't break down. It's what you call quite inert and slow turnover stuff. That's the first bit. Then added to that, there's probably about 1 to 2% of is actually organic matter in the soil. It does vary depending on the type of soils. Now, on the soils we're on slightly quite high, between 10 and some of the peat soils go up to 50% or even more. So that humus, very important, very inert, very slow turnover. So basically that's carbon-based, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and a bit of nitrogen and some sulfur in there, all tightly bound up, not easily broken down by microorganisms, so they can't really get at it. So it's actually very slow turnover of a long period of time, but you can build it up over time as well. So we'll come back to that later. So then we talk about the biological fraction. Now we're really talking, this is what we've got up in here, the biological fraction. I was on a talk the other week, and it's a really good way to put this. On a hectare of land, you can run about 16 sheep, okay? That's your sheep. Underneath in the soil, on an arable soil, which is actually the one that's got probably the least organisms in it, you'll probably have 5 tons of biologicals. That's equivalent to about 100 sheep. Now, it depends which way. So there's actually 100 sheep living underneath. Now, if you then go to a long-term grassland, so like what we call permanent grassland soil, that can be up to 50 tons a hectare, which is at least 100 sheep, if not more, depending on, it all depends on how you measure your sheep. But 1,000 sheep, so not 100,000 sheep. So that's, you think, imagine 1,000 sheep on an area. And another way of looking at it, if you talk about, you could look at it as bunny rabbits. If it was rabbits, that's equivalent to 30,000 rabbits per hectare. Now that is biologically active organisms living under your feet in the soil. That's just amazing. You think about 3 rabbits per square meter actually living in the soil in effect. And I mean, that's just, it's mind-boggling when you think about it like that. So what's going on in this soil? Where's this organic matter coming? It's made up from what we call the micro to the macro fauna. So we talk about the micro, goes right down, and right at the bottom is actually bacterial viruses, and they obviously infect bacteria. And you've got a range of different types of bacteria doing all sorts of strange, crazy things. And you've got the fungi, the next stairs in the chain. Then you go up to the protozoa, and then eventually you get to sort of things like earthworms, which are the top of the tree, as it were. And you've got the mites and my favorite is Coleombra, which is actually a type of arthropod that lives in the soil. It's just amazing. And so you've got a whole range there going through. And then we really shouldn't forget the megafauna, which is the stuff that lives on top, because that's pretty important too, because you need grazing animals actually feeding the soil and rotating the nutrients around in the soil. So there's a whole thing going on. Now, we're coming back to what we were talking about, is that cyclical process. and with everything's connected together. Now, all these microorganisms living under our feet, we can't see them. They're all firing up, they're going off, and they're living off one another, and they're living with one another. They're obviously attacking one another as well. They're eating one another, but it's a cyclical process. And there's and those figures there for just one tiny amount of soil, in just a handful of soil, there's so much going on. There's more biological activity and more biological diversity in that small amount of soil than there is in a rainforest, for instance. You know, the number of species, different types of species, genera even, just mind-boggling. And so the critical thing with all this is, what are we doing to the soil? What's up with the soil? So we've got the soil challenges. Can I move on to the next slide, please? Right, so this is a typical example of, it's quite obvious, good, moderate, poor condition soil. Now, what we've tended to find is, because we've been going down this the scientific, you know, it's not really, it's a particular way of dealing with soil. We've tended towards the poor condition soils, because we've not actually been concentrating on looking after our soils. We've been thinking that they're just an innate object that we just have to sort of like throw nutrients at and then it just grows on. Not the case. We have to start working on looking after them, and it takes a while for this to show up. So basically, you've got the three types there. You've got a very good soil that's very finely divided when it breaks down. It's very friable, and if you just read what's in there, it just the middle one, not so viable, not so friable, a lot more sort of heavy, lumpy bits, and then a really bad one where it's just all solid and rough and tough. And the problem with those different types of soils is the one on the left has got much more oxygen in it, because it's got much more more pore holes, and they're much bigger, and the other end has got very, very little oxygen in. So that's what we call anoxic. Problem with that, because going between the good type and the bad type means you get anoxic conditions. There's no oxygen, then you get different bacteria living in, bacteria and fungi living in those, and they actually are detrimental to some of the things we're trying to do with soil. I mean, there is a lot of anoxic or bacteria that live without oxygen within a soil, even with a good soil, and that's a natural process, but you can get too much of it and then it causes trouble. The classic one is actually the things we're concerned about now, like methane production and dinitrogen monoxide, which is nitrogen oxide, which is actually produced by in soils which are in bad condition. They're ameliorated by these they're caused by these sort of factors, very anaerobic conditions, and that's caused by poor structure, poor management of the soil, really. They're caused by cultivation, too much cultivation, a lot of arable farming with no rotation, compaction caused by heavy machinery, because we've all got to bigger machinery because we've got less men to do the work and less people to do the work. And so we're having to do, you know, there's problems with that. Added to which, these are the other things that are starting to come in now, is rainfall and drought, which are caused by excess rainfall, which is sort of like flooding, and drought, which is obviously the opposite of it, caused by climate change, which is actually making these things worse. So there are soil challenges. As you said, we want to be going to the good conditioned soil. We don't want to be in the poor conditioned soil. And because that one is the one that's going to give us all the things and all the benefits we need for our crops to grow better, and also to do other things as well, which we'll come on to in a minute. So can I have the next slide, please? So soil improvement. The simple answer, the way to define this is, it's feeding those 1,000 sheep. And if you've only got 100 sheep, you need to get to 1,000 sheep. And how do you do that? You've got to give them the nutrients and the food to do so. And they'll do it for you. They'll just keep breeding and getting bigger and more of them. So that's what it's all about. So how do we feed the sheep? As I say, feed the 1,000 sheep, or get to 1,000 sheep under my feet. The big factor is that soils, sorry about that. Soils, all those sheep need feeding, so it's about feeding them. So it's about how we manage our soil to actually get the nutrients into that soil in the right way, to allow it to actually, for that biodiversity to flourish. And there's two things to that. You've got to put stuff into it, but you've also got to treat it in a certain way. It's like nourishing your sheep. You've got to feed them water, and you've got to give them the grass, and you've also got to look after them so you don't end up with disease and stuff like that, and the environment has to be right for them. So how do we go about that? Well, the big thing about soil is it's about covering it, because all soil naturally will be covered in vegetation. So it would be, and that vegetation is feeding the soil by the roots via photosynthesis going on in the plants, and then the plants die off, and then they go into the soil, and then the worms, as you see there, then take those nutrients down. The bacteria and the fungi all work on it, and it goes into the soil, and then you get this cycling going on within the soil, and that creates your humus in it, because you want to get the humus concentration going up. So that's what you need. You need to be able to get that into the soil, that feed, and that's the critical thing. The main way to get it in is through that photosynthetic radiation, and then bring it in. So you don't want to have bare soil. You want to have soil that's actually alive. And obviously the big problem is that historically we've always thought about people used to plow in the autumn for winter fallows, and there was a good reason for that. Obviously it was controlling weeds, but the trouble is you don't want to do that, because you want to have something living on the soil. And a lot of modern farmers think, oh, I need to burn my crops off and then have a bare fallow in the winter so I can actually get in the spring and it'll grow better. It's not what you want to do. You want to be lots of green cover, and you need to create green cover all the time, and keep green cover on your crops, on your field, on your land, to actually make it grow. So the advantage obviously in the grassland system is that you've actually got that already, because you've got grass there. Okay, then it's just about managing that grassland and actually using the different ways, maybe using more of the, which we come on to next, which we use in both sides, both arable systems and cropping systems. We actually look to introduce clover or leguminous crops, actually produce the nitrogen, which is part of what we need to make this stuff grow, and also just the biomass to actually create, to actually allow everything else to go on under the soil. So what we've got to look at is, again, how we're going to do this, how we're going to get those things in. There are some good things you can use in terms of plants you can apply. I grow some deep rooting chicories, not the type of chicory that I sell to people, because these are different. These are what they call a grazing chicory, and actually that's got a really deep tap root, and it's sort of like it'll go for about 2 or 3 years in the field. So if we've a long break from cropping, you put one of these in. It would be a mixed chicory, a mixture of clovers, different types of clover, and some grasses, to actually create a nice diverse, so we're talking diverse here, so it's back to this thing again about not having just one thing, have a diverse range of things to develop that soil on. So that's one thing you can use. Also, between crops, we'll tend to put in clover lays or just cover crops. Phacelia is quite a good one. It grows very fast and it produces lots of pollen. It's great for pollinators. It's got lovely purple flowers, and that's really useful as well as a method of just keeping a cover on the ground, pulling in nutrients, keeping the nutrients. The really deep rooting of the chicory is actually dragging up nutrients from deep in the soil. So obviously this regolith, which is the rock underneath, is breaking down over time. That's releasing things like phosphates and potassium, which are very important for soil health. And actually they can bring those up to the surface for the shallow rooting crops and for the animals, for want of a better word, in the soil to actually use them, rather than us having to apply them necessarily. So obviously we use that, and we use catch covers and different types of catch covers. When I say catch cover, it's basically you put something in just to give you a covering, very quick growing, and sometimes depends on the seed type. Some of those small seeded, lots of them, and you get a cover quick, or you want big seeded because they can produce a big plant very quickly. Maybe in low light levels, like you probably plant beans in the autumn later on, especially around here. To give you that cover crop, and then basically that just gives you cover. That means the roots are going down to soil. They're feeding they're feeding nutrients up and down both ways. It's a two-way street, and it's just back to this business about it's all part of something else. So all this, what this will give us then also is actually what that does is actually looking to increase our biological activity in the soil. So then you get added to that is this thing called carbon capture. Basically, that humus you're making more of it now, because you're actually feeding more stuff into the soil. So you're actually making more humus. That humus is actually carbon capture at work. So actually, if you monitor that, then all of a sudden you're finding you're actually going to you benefit. You're actually getting the CO2 out of the atmosphere into the soil. You've got more biota, because that's all those the 1,000 sheep. We're aiming for 1,000 sheep. We might not quite get there with arable soil, but we'll get close. And that's really good because it improves a whole range of things to do with what we're talking about. Because you've got a biologically active soil, you've got more pore holes, like we just, when we went back to the other one where we're showing the good quality soil, you've got lots of openings in the soil, little tiny openings, microscopic openings, you can't see them. But the bacteria and the fungi and the smaller organisms are actually in there. And actually that's airspace. So you've got oxygen going in. So that means there's two things that are going on. When water falls into the soil, it gets absorbed into the soil and goes through. It doesn't just run off. So that's helping with flood prevention. And then the other thing is we've actually got there's complicated things about methane production and nitrogen oxide production out of soil, and actually it mitigates those because you've got more air spaces. You don't get that sort of thing going on. So this is all good stuff. And actually, added to all of this, I'll get a better crop from it as well, because if I do all these things, my crops will grow better. They will grow better. It's like if you're in your garden, you're actually adding compost to your garden all the time. That improves improves your garden. I've done it in my garden. Lots of compost on it. It's great. I've got to apply that to my farm now. It's a bit more difficult and complicated. We'll get onto that in a minute. Can I have the next slide, please? So I've probably got carried away here. We've got the adopted cropping system. So you've got on there, you can see the Vasilia, there's one on the right with a big bumblebee on it. And that's really amazing. Yeah. And the one next to it is the clover with the pink flowers, pink purpley flowers. And that is just, that's amazing when you get that growing, a clover plant. Because what the clover's doing is, not only is it giving you a cover crop, but actually the bacteria that live on the clover roots, called rhizobium bacteria, are actually making fertilizer for you. So they make nitrogen fertilizer in the roots. This is the amazing thing about the soil and about biology and the microorganisms there. Those rhizobia, they just make the nitrogen that we can make in a factory at 200 atmospheres with an awful lot of CO2 produced and huge temperatures, 400 degrees centigrade, but they just do it at room temperature, above 8 degrees centigrade actually, in the soil from nitrogen from the air. And they just make nitrate and ammonia, which is important for plants and for growth. And it's one of the main things. If you look at your plants in the garden, you're looking for nitrogen in your fertilizer, and of course they just make it. That's just amazing. And it gets me going every time when I talk about those. So that's what I'm going to use in my soils. That's my way with my systems. I put those in. I use them as cover crops, and you can see this circling. So obviously that's for me a kale crop for 2 years, then green reviewer for 2 to 3 years. Different, like as I said, different types to actually improve that, and to improve the soil and keep those worm counts up and keep everything fed, because it's about keeping it fed too. And just so important to keep them going, because obviously it gives resilience too, because then we've had some awful weather recently, and I've been noticing that on soils that I've been working on to maintain or improve, not maintain, we're improving the soils. I'm finding benefits in terms of I'm getting a better crop. I'm not having as much runoff, and I'm, the whole thing's working much better. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is one of the newer techniques that we're starting to use, and a lot of farmers are starting to use this. Can you see what we're doing there? We're sowing a crop, and we're going to plant our crop into that. And this is what I'll be doing next year. I'll be planting my kale crops into those strips we've tilled through the field, but we've not destroyed the cover, because you can see the cover crop alongside it. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to hold on to, something covering the soil the whole time, so I'm not losing that benefits that we talked about, all that nutrient cycling and because if you have to kill the surface off, and actually ploughing was was the traditional way of doing that. You just plough the field, and historically it was a reasonable thing to do. The problem is that you're inverting you're taking the soil and a bit like digging with a spade, and you're tipping it over on itself again. So you're tipping upside down. So you've got what do the worms do? They're going to struggle trying to get up and down through the soil profile to get to from the root from in the bottom, and the roots are broken up, and there's a whole range of things that are really, and it's not natural. Yeah, a natural soil wouldn't do that. There'd be a few moles knocking about, throwing a few mounds up here and there, but mostly it'd be just a nice level surface with the worms doing the work for you up and down, rather than big machinery having to do it. So there's a big, this is what we're trying to do. Well, we have to work a little bit so we can actually plant our plants in or sow our seed in. But we're trying to minimize the disturbance of the soil. So it gives us that benefit. So this is all part of trying to get that cycle going again. And it's just not about sort of, just blitzing the whole thing and just getting this bare soil, and then we can plant whatever we like in it and stuff like that. Very important to try and get this cycle. So this is one that's, there's more other techniques as well involved in this. So it's all about. Another one is actually when we have a what we call crimping machine. So we have a big roller on the front which flattens the crop down, the cover crop in front of it, and then behind we can put the strip till through, and that means we've got a big strong cover on. Then what you find is that's really good because actually it controls the weeds too, because I think called allelopathy. So what happens is that the cover crop that's been growing there before actually helps control some of the weeds. So I don't need to use as many herbicides. And I don't need to use, and then you've got benefits in soil chemistry and soil biology to probably mitigate how much pesticides I might have to use in the crop later as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So there's the future, sustainability of the ecosystem. It's about getting those worms to be able to move up and down, the bees going, doing all those things in the list there, maintaining food production, maintain the soil biota, not just maintaining, increasing it. We want to increase that soil biota. We want to be having a dynamic system. We've probably spent too long sort of like, we've been not necessarily trashing it, but it's been denuded it a little bit. And we want to get that going up the way. And we want to maintain those from the right down the bottom, the bacteria, right up to the earthworms, and even to the livestock on top. We've got quite a lot of megafauna knocking about, like rabbits and pigeons, and would you believe it, roe deer knocking about in our land, mostly because we're doing all these different things, and it's giving a much better environment for a whole range of things, not just my crops, for want of a better word. The other thing, like this, going back to this business about sequestering nitrogen, because not sequestering carbon. Because we do this, because we're growing that biota, we're actually sort of like stuffing CO2 back in the soil again, which is being denuded over time. I've seen some data on it. It's quite, there's quite a astounding amount of carbon dioxide has come out of soil into the atmosphere. So we can do the reverse of that. So we can be carbon negative in farming if we work this correctly. So that'd be really useful going forward. Okay, so I think I've just about done. So I don't know how long I've been talking for. I do apologise.
Not a problem, Chris, not a problem. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Right, questions. Chris, I hope you don't mind. I've actually got a question, so I'll go first, and let's talk to Chris. Why is your soil in South Lancs so good? I understand you farm on Grade 1 Class A farmland. What makes it so good?
I think this is Westland.
Presumably it's Margaret. Is somebody speaking? Can everybody make sure they're muted? Is that okay, everybody? Sorry, I just thought I heard a voice there. It might be me. Apologies. So, Chris, apart from all the work and passion you put into it, what makes your soil so good?
I think that it's all part, like we go back to the soil triangle, and there's actually an element of what was originally in the regolith and what's been in the input. There's quite a lot of sand and quite a lot of there's a bit of clay mixed in there, so that makes a good base. And I think it's probably a way it's been the way that soil has developed over thousands of years.
Yes.
Has created that sort of like, it's probably been a factor that it's been flooded quite a lot, which gives you the organic matter, and the peat soil, obviously that's sort of very wet, so that sort of stayed wet, and that's obviously why the peat's built up. And our sort of soil, we're not really sure, because it's got quite high organic content, so about 10%, But how that's all got there, we're not really sure, because actually it should be breaking down, but it isn't. It seems to be quite solid at that sort of level.
Yes.
So it's back to this humus business. You've got humus breaking down. Now, there is some elements. It's very interesting, actually. This is the historical thing about soils. Quite a lot of our soils, when I do a soil test, and you stick your soil in a bit of water, and then you sort of shake it about a bit, and I find all this stuff floating on the top, and I'm thinking, what's this? And you think, oh, it must be organic matter, because organic matter tends to float, but it's not. It's actually cinders. And I'm going, where did they come from? And actually,
Gosh.
the classic is we've got the Liverpool Leeds Canal snakes through us, and actually this was night soil that came out of Liverpool. So this is what we're talking about, this site thing again. The night soil was came out on the barges, and they dumped it on the fields, and actually that was growing crops because it was really good. It was nutritious. There would be lots of potassium from the fires that, they were burning coal or burning wood, so there was all that going on, and also added to which, the petties were being emptied into it and brought out, and actually that was tipped on the field as well. And that's a cycle thing. Very interesting argument about when we're talking about this business about feeding the soil. Maybe we should be thinking a little bit harder about what we do with all the sewage, because basically at the moment it goes to a sewage plant, gets all worked up, and then ends up in the sea. The water ends up in the sea, and we work very hard to clean that water up and get rid of all the organic matter and all the nutrients by a whole range of processes. And there's one called the Amomox process, which goes on there, which actually breaks the ammonium and the nitrate down to nitrogen that goes into the air. But that's a resource that we could use.
Yes.
Actually, so the argument
to me that seems a no-brainer. Yes.
It's very hard to actually. There are problems actually using. They have to be really careful using, obviously, recycling. But it's a I'm throwing it out there. We should be thinking hard about how recycling our own.
Yes, Chris, I've got some questions. This is from Claire Mumford. Chris, could you repeat the stat that you mentioned about the 16 sheep above ground, 1,000 underneath? How do you calculate, so to speak, those sheep? And she'd like to know, because she would like to repeat that stat and use it herself, but she says she'll mangle the explanation. I'm sure she wouldn't.
Well, basically,
so she would like to understand it more. So
okay, basically how that works is, if you look at a standard stocking density. Now, I'm not a sheep farmer, so I've taken that figure off somebody, a scientist who knows what a scientist, or basically you work at a standard stocking density. It's about 16 sheep per hectare, so per hectare of land. So what you're doing is you take you're measuring the mass of biological activity going on in the soil. So now you add all the bacteria, the fungi, all the microfauna to the macrofauna. You add the weight of that all up together, and then that gives you a figure. So in the case of even an arable soil, that adds up to 5 tons per hectare. So if you work on your average sheep being 50 kilos, you've got 100 sheep living underneath, because you've got 5,000 kilos. That's to explain it. And it even gets on a permanent grassland soil, you're up to 50 tons a hectare of biological activity. So and that probably includes the roots as well, of course, of the plants, because you're putting those in. But that's where you get to your 1,000 sheep, because it's like it's just maths.
It's a really, really good analogy, Chris. Question from Des Brennan of CPRE Lancashire, Liverpool City Region and Greater Manchester. Is there a significant variation in the constituents of the various kales?
Not particularly, no. They're all very much of a muchness, I think. They all contain the classic ones is of the vitamin C and your nutrients, the lutein. The green kales will carry the greener the plant is, the more lutein there is in it, which is actually very good for your eyes. So that's the important bit for your eyes, because against macular degeneration.
Yes.
But other than that, they're all much for muchness. There's not much great difference in terms of the nutrients in them. Or the only is that greenest bit. So the coloured ones are good because they've got anthocyanin in. So you've got anthocyanins in the purpley ones. So that's a different sort of nutrient that's beneficial.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Question, Chris. Joe Garrard, I hope I've pronounced the surname correctly. How long on average does it take for poor soil to recover using ups, and how deep is the till?
Basically, the cover crop can start making a difference immediately, because basically as soon as you start, you got your cover crop working into the soil and starting to grow into the soil, as long as it's actually producing, it's going in and starting to root, and the roots are getting down, and you don't have any problems at all. Like we saw the soil pans I did discuss, which you get very, when you get sort of like machinery can do it. Funny enough, actually, glaciation can do it as well, but that's another story.
Yes.
But, anything very heavy on the soil actually makes compaction, and obviously the roots can't get through that. So you have to work on that. You might, some plants can, because we've discussed this. I've discussed it with some soil scientists who actually use. That's why I've got my my chicories in there, because the chicory actually will punch through these sort of like hard patches of soil. Actually, because it's so good at rooting, it's so vigorous, it actually goes through and puts a hole in it. And then you don't even need to put the cultivator through. But we will tend to sort of cultivate. We had one field we did recently. We went to about 16 inches with a subsoiler, just to start to loosen it up before we then put our cover crop on. But as soon as you get the cover crop on, it's starting to benefit. And I'll probably do 2 or 3 years, and I'll crop for 2 years, and I'll go back and put another cover crop in, and you start to see the benefit within that time.
Yes.
Even within that 3-year period, you'll see it. The amount of worms just go, it's incredible, the number of worms that start developing because of that. That's one of the classic measurements, look for worms, because it's a really good measure of how much biomass you've got in the soil. You can do the measurements. There's ways to do that, but really quick, just get your spade out, dig the spade up and see how many worms you've got underneath. And I even just look at worm casts, which is actually what you see on the top when they've come up to the surface, and you can quickly tell. You've got lots of wormholes, you've got the worms are there, Okay.
Becca, has anybody got their hand up?
Yes, Graham has got his hand up.
Right, apologies, I can only see a few people on my screen as such. This is Graham Willis, I presume. Is that you, Graham?
Graham, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, it is. Thank you, Deborah. Sorry.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Chris, it's great to hear what you're doing on the farm, and really interesting presentation. I just wonder, one of the issues is how much do you think other farmers that you know, or through Leaf indeed, Leaf farmers I think are taking this kind of model forward, but how good is the take up in the area around you? Because obviously I think this is the right way to go, the kinds of management techniques you're using. And how far do you think we've got to travel to get all soils in good health?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I'm probably I'm probably at the front of it when I'm coming to this sort of thing. So I'm one of the first, the early uptakers, for want of a better word. There's still an awful lot of guys doing it, people doing it in the rest of the country, and I feel I'm sort of like behind the curve compared with some of them already, because there's some amazing stuff going on. And really working at actually improving the soils. I think it's just a process. You've got to get farmers into it, and it takes a while. They'll be looking over the fence, seeing what you're doing and what I'm doing, and thinking, well, I don't know whether I agree with that. But then what they do is they look at what happens. They talk to you, and then they see it's all about the benefit. If they see the benefit, then they'll start to do it as well. And I think that's important to show the benefit in terms of yields, in terms of production, in terms of value to them as well. So it's important that obviously, we can do all this. I mean, I'm doing this because there is an issue. Obviously, I can do this because I'm based a high value crop on it. So obviously, I can actually, I can put a 2 or 3 year lay in, because I know I'm going to get the benefit in those 2 years I'm cropping. The problem is, if you're in a more of an arable system where you don't have the same value, you have to think about how that's going to work. So it might be, I mean, there are things going on with the CRP, the new payment schemes, which actually are going to give us a benefit, I think, in terms of how we can actually go forward to actually fill that gap, to give the farmer a little bit more to put a cover crop in, and then he'll get the benefit later as well. But obviously, he doesn't get the same benefit as I would have got. So that's the problem. It's actually leaving the crop, leaving a cover crop in for sort of like 18 months when he's not getting any benefit from that. So you need to be thinking about how we do that, and there could be an argument to say, look, and I know, because if you do that, you actually got the carbon sequestration. There's a whole range of benefits, less flooding. There's all sorts of things come out of it. So, is that something that the farmer can get paid for? I don't, I'm just throwing it out there,
Interesting. That's interesting. Hilary Robinson, Chris, has commented, and I think this is an interesting point on nutrients. She says there's a theory that the sweeter vegetables now being bred have fewer nutrients. Is that right?
It just depends on all they're doing is increasing the sugar content and reducing the bitter flavors in so
it's a question of proportion, is it? I suppose if you have more natural sugar occurring in the vegetable, then there is less of the 100% available for really good minerals and vitamins, for example. Yes.
It would only be. It's just a genetic thing. You just tick up the regulation to actually produce a bit more sugar, a bit more sweeter, and also you probably tick down some of the things that actually cause the bad flavors, for want of a better word. It's a bit complicated because I can sort of agree with some of those things, because some of the bad flavors, the classic one is glucosinolates, and actually glucosinolates are actually considered to be, in sprouts, to give them that pungent flavor, and they're actually very good for you. The problem is that we've down-regulated the plants to produce not as much from the genetics, because obviously people don't like it. But the argument about that is it better that they eat vegetables than they don't eat vegetables? So the argument, you could say, well, it's maybe not quite as good for you as that pungent, nasty, tasting one, but will they eat it? No. But the point is, you can two ways of looking at it. You'll eat more, so you still get the benefits. So.
Right. Another question, Chris, from Nabila Amin. I hope you have pronounced the name correctly. Apologies if I've not. Is there a change in machinery and labour that is required with this method of soil improvement for short term and long term?
I would say that there is going to be changes. I mean, obviously the amount of the benefit will be, we're probably not going to use as much. We won't need to use as much cultivation, which is actually a good thing. So you're not burning as much diesel to actually create the till. And actually we're burning more and more diesel, because obviously as the soil, if you degrade the soil, then you need to work it harder with the machinery to actually get it into some sort of till that you can plant your crop into. So there's a two-way, if you improve the fertility of your soil and the crumb structure, basically what happens then is you don't need to spend as much money, you don't need to spend as much money on diesel or use as much money and create as much CO2 all that diesel. So that's it. And min till is really the way to go. I mean, I've been advocating for a long time. It's a classic. I always remember being told this by an Australian farmer when I was a long time ago. And it was that long ago, it was in the 20th century. And he said, he was talking to me, he said, oh yeah, you still use the mobile plough, don't you? Which is the old plough, He says, oh yeah, we still plough everything. He says, that's so 19th century, mate, that you told me. It's 200 years ago now.
Yes.
It's so old. You've got to move. They don't mobile. They've not mobile plowed for centuries almost in Australia now. All right,
it's retaining. It's retaining what's good and using the new when it's appropriate, isn't it? It's the right balance.
Right,
Chris,
right.
That was fascinating. Really, really good. I've learned so much. Thank you. So now I'd like to ask Helen to give her presentation, everybody. So Helen, are you ready?
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay before I continue?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can, Helen.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so this evening then I'm going on to talk about the link between ponds and soils. And in particular, I'll be talking about the lessons learned from the British Ecological Society Great Twin Pond Dig. And the link is that this bit of this activity or bit of research was carried out on Chris's land. So that's how Chris and I know each other, and I'm very, very happy that we got into contact through this. So just to give a bit of a background, I'm part of the UCL Pond Restoration Research Group, and I research ponds, but in particular farmland ponds, and these typically are historical marl pits. And you can see in this diagram here that an example of a marl pit might have one steep side and a gentle slope. And the pond is actually a byproduct of an excavation process where people were taking clay or this marl-like substance and spreading it across the fields. And this has happened all the way back from Roman times through the medieval period, but particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so this is the focus of our work. And here's a lovely example. When I was lucky enough to go on a hot air balloon flight of the kind of marl pits that we get in Lancashire. So there are lots of them, and some are open, as we just saw, and you can see many more of these patches in the landscape of trees. So they just look like copse of trees in the middle of the field. And as a child, I always used to wonder why they were like this. Why would a farmer leave a patch of trees in the middle of the field? So I know from our research already that we have a net loss of historical farmland ponds or marl pits, and this is either through terrestrialisation or lost through infilling. There are many overgrown ponds at the same stage of succession, and there is not enough pond conservation to compensate. But there's this historical evidence of creation and management. So we as a group are trying to increase management and restoration. And the approach that we take when we're doing these pond restorations are to remove the vegetation from the majority of the pond, leaving some habitat, and then to remove some sediment with a digger. And thus sort of allowing that seed bank to regenerate. And an example from a previous bit of work here, we can see the first pond that we actually restored was Sailor's Black Pit. And we can see this colonisation from restoration through the spring when you get an algal growth, and then the September where the plants start to come in, through to the next year where the pond starts to flourish again. And from my PhD research, we looked at 45 ponds in total, one in an unmanaged landscape, as in ponds were not managed for biodiversity, and then on a farmland owned by Richard Waddingham. And we compared the biodiversity in the water of those ponds, and we see much more wildlife in the ponds that are managed and open. So bringing you forward to the Great Twin Pond Dig and Lancashire. This was linked in with the research that went on in Norfolk where my PhD work happens. And this was all about trying to get the communities involved with pond restoration and some monitoring around that. So we looked at 4 ponds, 8 in total, 4 in Lancashire, 4 in Norfolk. And we restored 2 of each, and we kept 2 as controls. So I just want to focus on one of these that we did at Chris's now, just to run through the process. So you can see these ponds in the landscape at Chris's, on Chris's farm. And this is taken from Cleves Hill overlooking Chris's farmland. And if we zoom in, we can see here 2 different views of these ponds. An aerial view shows the 4 ponds that we looked at. And the two to the right of the screen on the aerial view are the two that we restored initially. And just to give you a bit of an oversight of the area, this map is a little bit of historical research I did. The ponds that are marked with a red mark, a red circle as such, or a way marker, are all ponds that are still there and open. And the pond crosses are those that have been lost over time. So this is a historical map of the area, and the crosses are those that have been lost over time, and the crosses that are pink are on land that is Chris's land. So we can see those same 4 ponds towards the southwest of the map here, and they're the ponds for the Great Twin Pond Dig. So let's just have a very, very quick look through Molyneux Pond 1. So this was a really, really shallow pond with 2 basins. And when we first went to visit it, it was pretty much dry by the time we got to June. So we started monitoring in around April, and it was a really, really shallow basin on one side. And this was dry by the time we got to June. So there's an example. And we can see willows are actually growing in the basin of the pond. So they've really encroached from around the edge, fallen in, and then continued to grow up. We got volunteers involved from Edge Hill University. It was really, really fantastic in removing some of the vegetation from around the pond. And then we had chainsaw workers who were specialised and able to go and do the more technical work for the team. So you can see Chris there in the right hand of the picture, trying to probably avoid the photo. And during this process, we found some bits of litter. And I'm showing you this pond because it was probably the most dramatic pond restoration I've been involved in, and I've been involved with quite a number. And I've got a lovely video here, because actually when we started to dig out the pond on this shallow basin, I had not realised, and this is a very quick time lapse, that actually the pond was completely infilled with litter. It had been dumped in, and this is actually the end of that process, where we got back to the clean mud, and we were just moving whatever we couldn't get rid of, and created a big pile behind the ponds which would revegetate. But a lot of work happened before that, and that was mainly done by Chris, myself, and my mum, who I dragged into, and we had somewhat of a long day trying to remove as much litter as we could from the soil. And you can see that huge pile which we were able to put into a skip. And just showing you here the bag of plugs. So it wasn't farm waste, and this pond is actually at the end of a track. And so we believe that a long time ago this was dumped with this waste, and it was before Chris's time on this patch of land. And so following that restoration, we can see, if you gradually work down the pictures on the screen now, we can see the colonisation around Pond 1. And then just to show you that dramatic before and after, this is the shallow basin, pre-restoration and following it. And a very proud farmer, Chris, there. And I just wanted to share this with you, which is the temperature of the ponds that we looked at on Chris's land. And we can see here something of interest. So the 2 ponds that we restored, we called Molyneux 1 and 2, and they're in the blue lines. And the ponds that we did not restore are 3, 4 and 5, and they are in the yellow, pink and brown lines. And one of the things that we found out through very simple monitoring with the volunteers is the fact, not surprisingly, that when we opened up the ponds 1 and 2, we got a much higher temperature in the pond water. And the other interesting thing that you can see very obviously in this graph is that the ponds actually dried up. So the ones that we did not restore dried up. It was a very strong drought year in 2018, and they dried up. And previously, our restored ponds 1 and 2 had always dried up. So we made a big difference just by, even in the simplest fact that we now have water maintained in the landscape, which is very important as we see the effects of climate change moving forward. And this is just a very quick overview of Pond 5 as well, because this is one we did later on, and this is another stage. We try to encourage pond restoration not to all happen at once, so that we have ponds at different ages in the landscape. And so we've done this a bit later on, and it was really looking fantastic in October. It had gone over slightly, but it was lovely to visit it at sunset in October. So let's talk about ponds and soil then. And the two main links between surrounding land use and ponds are as followed. Firstly, a direct input from historical tile drains or pipes and or ditches, so a direct input, and then a kind of indirect input of fertilizers or pesticides, because of the presence and absence and depending on the depth of buffer strips surrounding the ponds. So I just put this, I couldn't miss putting a picture of Chris on again, because whenever I think of ponds and soil, I do think of Chris. But I also had a quick look when I was researching this about any advice about ponds and protecting ponds from chemicals and runoff. And really the advice for ponds on farmland is just the same as when you're considering your own garden pond. So it's really about protecting your pond for any input coming in and it explains on websites such as Total Pond, they suggest putting planting around the edge, and pretty much that's what we suggest on farmland ponds. So let's have a look at some examples. And just to give you a bit of background, first of all, I found a paper here, and there's not really papers about ponds and buffers, but I did find an interesting paper on a slightly different subject, which is about using ponds to buffer other water bodies such as streams by creating a pond to then with then putting alder in around that pond, and then that would bring out some of those nutrients before it went into a watercourse. So we can see at the top picture here though is a really good diagram of how tile drains or nutrient inputs come into a pond. And it was interesting in this paper, the fact that they were saying that, you know, the dry buffer strips are, you know, this might be an opportunity to use these instead of dry buffer strips. We're looking at ponds in a completely different way tonight. We're thinking about protecting ponds, not using ponds to protect other water bodies. But I just wanted to share that because I think that's a really good, easy diagram to understand. And again, as well, we can see on the right-hand side of the picture, this idea of a buffer strip around the pond. So a couple of examples then from Chris's land and from the project, the Great Twin Pond Dig project. One interesting example is we knew that already there were tile drains or historical pipes leading into the ponds from the surrounding land, and this is typical in Lancashire. And I think this happened after the extraction of the marl. These ponds were used for many different things, and then over time people have realised that as a very wet county, ponds are an opportunity to get rid of some of that water off the ground, off the crops, and into a safe holding space. But one example here is one pipe that we had to put in because the ground was so wet around the pond one following the restoration. But you can see how the vegetation flourished around this pipe, and you can see the picture here, how clear the water is. And this is just another example. I only took this the other day, and you will always see ponds at this time of year in a very grey state, and that is just because of the sheer amount of nutrient input that's coming, and the soil, the sediment rather than nutrient input, I should say, coming from around the surrounding land with so much water. And this is just to show Chris's land where the water comes in. But again, the water coming into that pond was crystal clear. Another direct input can be ditches, and these can directly come into ponds, and they can be either in the form of an inflow or an outflow as well. And often ponds have both, the ponds that I see. So just two examples underneath here of very nice ditches, dry ditches, and that's what I like to see, because therefore there's not much nutrient or not much inflow coming into the pond. But we had a very interesting example with the Great Twin Pond dig, in the fact that just before we started restoration and we were already monitoring, whilst doing some mammal trapping, we realised that the next door neighbour of Chris's had decided to clean out his or her ditch, and therefore we had a ditch now not maintaining that vegetation that would hold the soil in. But now any soil, if there was lots of water that came in, would flow freely into our pond that we were just about to restore. And we tried to mitigate against this, and you can see on the left-hand picture here, this is pond 2, which is one we were going to restore, and you can see the ditch sort of winding down into it. And we really tried to, when we did the restoration, we decided to leave some of those trees in the similar way to that paper was doing, leave some of those trees to try and take up any nutrient input that would come in, try and stop as much water coming into the pond itself as possible. And with just those two things, we also built up the back side of the pond with some soil to try and create a bit more of a barrier. And we did our best to protect our pond as much as possible, but with the sheer amount of rainfall that we had, the water still managed to come over and into our pond. So you can really see the impact of the clean ditch on pond 2, and it's always going to be slightly more browner in colour and full of sediment. But one lovely example here is how the bank, and this is a photo taken from the same time, came back full of foxgloves, which will create this buffer, which we'll go on to talk about. So that's the learning point from there. So the learning point from pond 2 is that seed banks create a buffer around the pond, so that all came back naturally, and also a wonderful habitat for wildlife. We had 2 other learning points from this, and I wanted to share with you the water level diagram here. And this is the water levels of all 4 ponds. And if you remember, 1 and 2, those in blue, it all rhymes, those in blue are the ponds that we restored. And again, the restored ponds don't dry out. We can see that there. But also, only from monitoring, and we didn't realise this before we got the results of the monitoring, we could hear some inflow coming from there, but we thought ponds 1 and 2 might be joined, but actually it turned out that pond 2 and 3 were joined. And you can see this impact of this tile drain, because we had much more sediment input coming from this cleaned out ditch and into pond 2 that then went into pond 3. We can see over time, now it's never been a very clear pond because it does need restoring itself, but we can see towards the end, we've got this very, very murky brown water at the end of 2018. And this is when we got the results in and realised that this was happening. But you can see the water level fluctuation still from August the 6th, and then it dries out, sorry, the 30th of June, and between August the 6th or over the course of a month, and then it gets wet again. So we can see that these are not holding water in the same way our restored ones are. So let's just talk finally about buffer strips. And there's a few things to consider, but really the main point is that there's no direct, with no final evidence of, you know, what size buffer strips you should have. So the idea of the buffer strip is to protect any natural habitat from the surrounding farmland for away from pesticide input or nutrient input. And so the idea is the bigger the better. And this paper, as an example here, recommended at least 6.6 metres. And it was an important way to reduce pesticide toxicity in Danish streams. Again, it's an example from buffer strips and streams, and this kind of research has been done a lot more on rivers and streams than ponds, so we're keen to do this. So 10 metres, you know, is a really great buffer strip. The bigger the better, but often we say a minimum of 3, 10 feet, 3 metres. 10 metres would be amazing, but it's not actually necessarily practical. But here we've got a lovely example of where you can do this kind of thing, is when you have ponds at the side of the field or an edge and it dips in, and then you create a straight line of crop, and this is in Norfolk. So it is easier to facilitate on field boundaries. And a good wide buffer strip for a scientist is one that you can do spread out and do your research on. And if you can't, and if you haven't got space to do that, or you have to do it in the cropped area, you know that that narrow buffer strip is too narrow indeed. And so therefore the run-in is much higher and you don't get as much diversity in the pond. But always on Chris's farm, I've been so pleased to see, and this was happening already, a lovely large buffer strip where you can see this larger, higher grass around the edge of the pond, even prior to restoration. And again, as we saw, as the material grows back, the vegetation grows back, we've created these large buffer strips around the restored ponds too. And this is just a lovely piece of work by West Lancs wildlife member, one of our volunteers on the Great Twin Pondic, and she looked at ponds, looked at vegetation, terrestrial vegetation, plants inside and outside of the ponds, and how many there was, the species richness. And we can see here that on ponds 1 and 2, there's a really high amount of larger number of species, because we allowed light to them than those that were still needed restoration. So it's probably a bit complicated to explain there, but hopefully you get an overview of what's going on. So in conclusion, buffers can reduce input from pond catchments, and plus you can reduce the inflow as well to a pond. However, as we've noted from Chris's talk this evening, I've seen from the work that I've done that it's not always feasible, and it certainly isn't any substitute at all for the following. First of all, reducing the amount of fertilizers and pesticides where possible. Secondly, being aware and mindful about when these nutrients are applied, which is something that I know Chris does. And thirdly, really what we've heard from Chris, being an expert, is prioritising soil health. And that's why it's been really fantastic to walk around Chris's ponds and see, as the seasons go on, that there are only very short periods where this land is bare soil, and very quickly either crops are on and flourishing, or my dog's favourite is when it's all been put into a grassland, just to bring back some of the nitrogen and things, or something back into the soil and stabilise it, which she very much enjoyed. So I will leave it there. I've got other information I can say, but I will leave it in case there's questions. I'll just skip through these slides because I've already gone over time, and I will finish on a lovely picture of me and Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. That's a super photograph, and that was a really good talk. I confess I just know so little about farm ponds. I thought a pond in the countryside was pretty much the same wherever you went, really. And clearly this it's a completely different kind of dynamic, isn't it? Helen, is the wildlife, the biodiversity, different in a farm pond that's managed and say a pond in a garden that may be similarly managed? Is the biodiversity different, or is it roughly the same?
A well-managed pond with lots of oxygen in, because you've got plants and you know, it can be very similar in a garden
Yes.
pond. And yeah, so if it's in good health, you will get the same sort of species such as dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies, snails, because there's they can graze off the plants.
Yes.
When you get a poor quality pond, you can identify a poor quality pond because you'll get things like hog louse, which are very similar to woodlice that we see. That's the cousin of the woodlouse, and they do the same kind of job as a woodlouse by breaking down kind of any dead material and things. So they're able to live in that. You'll see leeches, you'll see mosquito fly larvae, things like that. So things that can survive where there's not much oxygen, then you'll know your pond health regardless of what habitat it's in.
Yes. A question from Joe Garrard, Helen. Why is alder as a tree so good for cleaning water, particularly in buffer zones?
Yeah, this was just an example. I don't know if it's, you know, particularly good. It was an example from a paper in Denmark, and obviously I think that's probably the kind of the tree that most typically grows around water, and so it's more about it being able to tolerate the water and wet woodland. And we actually get similar ponds surrounded by alder in Lancashire, whereas in Norfolk it's, you know, in Lancashire we get willow as well.
Yes.
But in Norfolk it's much more typically willow and then possibly ash.
Yes.
And around everywhere you hopefully get big ancient oaks as well, which are always lovely to see. But it's more about plants that can, trees that can tolerate water, I would imagine, and what's naturally occurring in Denmark.
Yeah. Question, Helen, for you from Des Brennan. Have core samples been taken from the bed of ponds to obtain information of historical interest?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And we actually did take some core samples from the ponds at Chris's, but with the hope of a student maybe one day having a look at them. So we did it before restoration. So they're lying there, but nobody's been able to do them yet. So if anybody's really keen, I don't know, a budding core scientist, you can do that. But there's another PhD student that has researched this specifically on the ponds in Norfolk. I took a core just before we did our first restoration, and they've been able to look at the timelines. You've found periods where the Industrial Revolution is, and you can map back through the time, and you can actually see where ponds have been managed and where they've been left, and differences with fish scales. You can see when there's been fish and all sorts of things. So it's a really, really fascinating area, paleoecology, and something the research team does. So yeah, if you're interested in that, have a look at the UCL Ponds website, and you'll find some research on that and links to papers.
Right, thank you. Helen, a question from Graham Willis. Is there any evidence about species movement between ponds and how close they need to be for that to work well? Graham's thinking about the value of networks of ponds that we might need to restore.
Yeah, great question again. Absolutely, yes. There's lots of research out there. It's mainly being done on some of the easier things to monitor, such as amphibians, great crested newts. There's lots of research on great crested newts, and that's an important species in terms of conservation. But there's also work that's being done on dragonflies as well. And, you know, yes, it definitely is going to fit into the Nature Recovery Network, and it's something that the Norfolk Ponds Project, which I'm also part of, we're really trying to do strategic mapping now, and I've actually got an interesting proposal for a project going ahead that's to do with mapping ponds. So yeah, that's a really good question, and yes, the closer and the more ponds there are, in the more dense they are in an area, the more movement there is, and we've started to be able to monitor this. And also that's one of the reasons that we say that ponds shouldn't all be restored in a landscape at the same time. It should happen gradually so species have an opportunity to move around and connect.
Yeah. It's a form of wildlife corridor, isn't it, really? It's the same kind of principle, yeah. Question for you from Nabila Al-Amin. Will the farm ponds you have restored need re-cleaning and ongoing maintenance? Presumably they will.
Yeah, so for instance, typically we say that they need management, light management, sort of, and it depends, really depends on pond, but it's usually about every 3 to 7 years. And that can be done by a team of volunteers. It's really easy. If you keep on top of it and just trim off around the edge, then you only really need to do the vegetation management. Now, the examples that I showed you of pond 2, where you've got that nutrient input, that's always going to be a case that the soil within the pond, or sediment within the pond, is going to build up gradually. And when you get this loose sediment, it prevents seeds from really like digging in and then being able to grow, so plant seeds. So that's one of the reasons we try and scrape back to the hard marl again when we do a restoration, so it creates a firm substrate in which to root. So the chances are that pond 2 with that sediment input is, you know, might need to be scraped out again, but it won't be by any means anywhere near that first restoration. And often I know on Richard Waddingham's land that, you know, a digger can be hired for a day, and you just go and do patch scraping, and some of them just open it up a little bit and go around, you know, 3 or 4 in a day and just have a little tickle, and that keeps on top of it. So yes, ideally you can do it, but if you didn't have that sediment input again, you wouldn't necessarily need to do it in the future.
Yeah, right. I don't think there are any more questions for you, Helen. I've managed to now scroll through the list of attendees, and I can't see any hands raised. If anybody does have their hand raised, do please sort of shout. Right. So actually, are there any more questions for Chris or for Helen? Anybody? I'll just scroll through and make sure nobody's put it into the chat. So I think we are right. Okay, well, can I say on behalf of us all, Helen and Chris, tonight has been really, really good. I'm sure I speak for lots of people. I've learned so much. The graphics and the videos and the films and the photographs have been really good. And you've both, it's clear to me that you're both really interested in your subject, passionate, and I just love that. I think it's great. Bring it on. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you would like to go on to CPRE's website, you'll see more of what we're doing, and do have a look at our social media to see what's going on, what's happening. And if you would like to make a donation, that would be very much appreciated. Okay, everybody, thank you and good night.